Good afternoon, mayors, business partners, and distinguished guests. I'm Mayor McKinley Price, Mayor of Newport News, Virginia, and also current president of the African American Mayors Association. And it is my pleasure to welcome you back to session two of AAMA's Fall Policy Series. The African American Mayors Association has created this virtual series for our mayors, our business and strategic partners, and their policy staff to discuss various topics aimed towards cultivating more innovative and sustainable communities. Today's session, Fostering Civic Engagement and Community Trust, is in partnership with ShotSpotter and Lyft. Join the conversation on Twitter by using the hashtag AAMA policy and follow us at Our Mayors for live updates. At this time, I will now turn it over to AAMA Executive Director and General Counsel, Stephanie Mash Sykes.
Thank you, Mayor Price. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Stephanie Mash Sykes, and I'm excited to be with you this afternoon. The coronavirus pandemic and events leading up to George Floyd's death have unearthed issues, and among them, implicit bias and racial inequities in policing. Civil unrest and calls for police reform highlight that there are opportunities for us to do better. With the current outcry, we would like to engage on questions such as, how can technology support local governments and law enforcement's ability to effectively protect and rebuild important relationships within your community? Today, we will discuss how technology can support the path forward, specifically addressing how community leaders can build trust and community confidence by mitigating bias and tackling over-policing, ensure officer accountability and transparency to drive better outcomes, and lastly, implement the right strategies focused on improving community safety. Joining us today is an esteemed panel. First, we have Mayor Steve Benjamin, the mayor of Columbia, South Carolina. He is the first African-American mayor in Columbia, South Carolina's history. He was elected in a record turnout in 2010. He also served as the president of the African American Mayors Association and served as the 76th president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. Among his many accomplishments include he introduced the Justice for All initiative in 2014, which implemented new training, competitive pay, diverse representation, and community engagement to strengthen the foundation of trust and accountability that exists between our communities and law enforcement agencies. Under his leadership, Columbia was among the first in the nation to ban bump stocks, which allowed semi-automatic weapons to fire with increased speed. Next, we have Ralph Clark, President and CEO of ShotSpotter. Ralph grew up in Oakland, and the combination of his upbringing and professional experience has led him to become an empathetic advocate for the responsible use of technology in building safer communities and institutional trust. He holds an MBA from Harvard Business School, and he's held executive leadership positions for a number of technology companies before accepting the CEO position with ShotSpotter in 2010. He has received the 2019 Entrepreneur of the Year Award for Northern California. He has served on the board of a number of community and social organizations, including the Oakland Boys and Girls Club. And our third panelist is Deputy Chief Melron Kelly of the Columbia Police Department. He holds a master's degree in justice administration from the University of Louisville and has graduated from several professional law enforcement leadership programs over the years. He began his career with the City of Columbia Police Department at the age of 13 when he joined the Explorer program in 1990. In 1999, he became a police officer, and over the years, he was promoted to various leadership roles, culminating in his current appointment as deputy chief. In addition to his police career, he has also served as a member of various community and social organizations, including Cities United, National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, Sowing Seeds, Inc., the NAACP, Harmony, Inc., Omega Phi Phi fraternity, don't get that wrong, and other community affiliations. So if we could just get started and jump right in, I'm going to share our first question for Ralph. So Ralph, In the months following George Floyd's death and even to today, we've heard communities across the nation demand equity in policing and calling to defund the police. How do you interpret the recent calls to defund the police from your perspective as a corporate leader?
Yeah, that's a great question, Stephanie. And first of all, thank you very much for having me on this panel, and good afternoon, everyone. I guess in a bit of a counterintuitive way, I'm generally positive on the calls for defund the police movement, because despite the confrontational and aggressive branding that goes along with defund the police, there's a lot of energy and focus that it's bringing. And I think that energy and focus is oftentimes required to get people to break into the room where it happens. And I'm finding that when community gets into the room and has these conversations in detail, the conversations don't go to abolish the police or literally defund the police. They go more to having discussions around reimagining and re-envisioning police and pushing back on the notion that their communities should be over-policed and underserved at the same time. And I think these are extremely valuable conversations that need to be had. And I think it gives us all an opportunity to do better and have police and law enforcement be much more accountable to communities, particularly those communities that are at risk and underserved. And we'll talk about technology later, but I feel like the biggest tool that a law enforcement agency has, frankly, in driving public safety outcomes is community engagement. That's probably far more powerful than any technology or any kind of man-resourced application of law enforcement. When you have community buy-in, you can just do so much more in terms of driving public safety outcomes. So hopefully we'll have a chance to talk a little bit later about how technology can really help bring about that community engagement.
Thanks, Ralph. And I really want this question also to go to the mayor, because I know this is a topic that's gaining more traction. So Mayor, would you please chime in also on the calls to defund the police from a mayoral perspective?
No, I think I appreciate Ralph's very thoughtful and creative approach to appreciating the pain and the voices and the dialogue, because that's what we need. I mean, Stephanie, we've been at this for a while. Certainly, I want to first thank President Price for his leadership of AAMA, but the work that we've been doing for the last several years on 21st century policing, they're really trying to address the structural issues that affect policing and the quest for justice here in our country. We've been working all around the framework and trying to institutionalize different practices, including the technology that we're going to talk about, to try and help us get at very least a race neutral or a class neutral, a neighborhood neutral approach to just solving crime and maybe if we're lucky enough, even preventing crime. But it's all that structural change is irrelevant if at the core of what we're talking about, there's not the trust there, the actual trust that exists there. And actually, trust is not there, but pain is there, based on the long-term effects of bias in policing. It means that we have to open the doors up and start a conversation. And once you have that conversation, it's so true. The folks who are screaming are very bright, are very intuitive. They know exactly what's happening all across the community. Once you start a conversation, they're like, no, we're not talking about that. We're talking about investing more in our communities, and we're talking about reimagining the way in which we create safer communities. Mm-hmm. And once you start that dialogue, it's amazing where it goes from there. And that's what we're endeavoring to do here in Columbia. So, we as you can tell, we recruit well here. We start recruiting our folks at 13 years old, like Deputy Chief Kelly. We let him go. He's going to tell you he hadn't gotten a raise since then, but that's not true. I will tell you. But we have invested heavily into recruiting talented men and women from our community, and Deputy Chief Kelly is representative of that. And it just requires a constant conversation, constant dialogue that does, yes, probably at some point talk about how you redirect certain resources different ways, in ways in which, regrettably, and the Mayor Price can testify to this, cities actually have to step up even more. And in the absence of federal funding, in the absence of state funding, we've got to be more creative in creating these intergovernmental, intersectoral, public-private partnerships that help us get the achieved goal. I've been around for a little while. There are very few things that make the hair stand up in the back of my neck, and the conversation around defunding doesn't do that as long as it helps us start a real and meaningful conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
We can't hear you, Stephanie. Uh-oh.
Oh,
There
hi.
you go.
Sorry about that.
There you go.
I was trying to fix some technical issues. Thank you so much. Would love to also hear from Deputy Chief McKinley, because I think this is a question of what would it look like? We've seen calls, just a line item reduction. Would love to hear from Deputy Chief Melron about your perspective and what those calls would look like practically.
Yeah, so as Ralph mentioned earlier, we welcome the conversation because what we're finding through our levels of transparency, that a lot of the things that our strong voices out in the communities are saying, we've already been doing. So we find that not only are we already doing a lot of the things that they're asking that we do, but a conversation definitely needs to be had around how we police and how we interact with the public. So anytime we can have those dialogues is always a good thing. As it relates to funding and how we, how the police is funded and how we police, I think anytime we can lessen the chances of someone having a law enforcement interaction needlessly, the better. That's built around mental illness encounters. It could be around juvenile encounters. Anytime we can come in a non-enforcement mode to engage with the public, the better. And I think leveraging technology is how we definitely do that. Being precise in how we police and where we go welcomes those non-enforcement encounters, and it puts us where we need to be to enforce the law. So I think welcoming the conversations about defunding or police interaction is definitely needed. However, this should be an ongoing conversation. On the protest line or the riot line is not a time for us to engage the public on how transparent we're being. This is an everyday 24/7 conversation that we have to have in law enforcement. And most importantly, those are some uncomfortable conversations, and we have to be willing to stay at the table and talk with our public and grow with them as well. So I think transparency and being effective in how we police are the most overwhelming things that we could do to move forward.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And so you mentioned technology. So I want to go back to Mayor Benjamin and ask him the question, technology or other strategies, what have you been doing in Columbia to increase trust and reduce bias in your community?
Well, we've invested in ShotSpotter. So I'll just lay it out for Ralph. We believed a long time ago, Stephanie, that in order to start these conversations, because at the core of what we're talking about how do you build a transparent system of justice that's founded on trust. Because realize that regardless of the size of your city, you can have 500 officers and 100,000 citizens, or 1,000 officers and 1 million citizens, whatever it happens to be. That 1,000 officers cannot keep a city of 1 million folks safe. It just can't, unless you have the trust of the community that invests in law enforcement, and that's something that you build over time. So what we determined is that if in fact you're going to be able to build that trust, you got to be able to show people data, real data that's humanized in a way that they can appreciate, not only understand it, because sometimes we think just because our folks might be from one part of town or might not have all the degrees and letters we have, or because they're working from paycheck to paycheck, they're not smart. Our citizens are pretty doggone smart, y'all. They're smart and they're engaged, and sometimes they're taking nothing and turning it into something. So we decided we were going to invest in coming to our citizens with clean and clear data to show, okay, you may believe that this is the case. Let us show you exactly how we're investing in a transparent and accountable system of justice here in Columbia. And mind you, we share that information in an accountability report every single year that is not in market document. It's put together like it's branded and it looks good and everything else, but it's not a marketing document because all the data in there is not always good data. But it gives us a roadmap that we can then share with the community and say, okay, this is what we're going to work on together to get better. But being able to share data, how many citizen encounters we had, what parts of town they are, how it's broken down by race and neighborhood. It's been a focus on data as a tool, as a great equalizer. So we've taken the next step over the last few years, investing in companies like ShotSpotter that help us get to the core of why some folks, quite frankly, just don't trust the government and trust law enforcement, because when gunshots ring out in their neighborhood, no one shows up. Now they don't realize that there's a high probability no one's called the police, because it's like the neighborhood I grew up in South Jamaica, Queens. We heard gunshots every night. It was part of the cadence. Some people in the South heard crickets. We heard gunshots. So people didn't call, and then if you did call, you called and said, "I heard gunshots." You didn't say, "I heard gunshots at 14226 Sutter Avenue." There was no data that could then allow the police to humanize that data and show up and say, not only we're responding quickly because your family is in danger, but we're engaging with everyone within the perimeter, making sure you understand that we're here and we work for you. And as a matter of fact, we showed up quick enough to maybe catch someone on the scene, maybe to help someone who is in need, and maybe even to collect some relevant ballistics evidence that might help us solve or prevent the next crime. When you do that, and you do it again and again and again in communities where that relationship doesn't exist, then you're building something there. And that's what we've been able to do here in Columbia because of this unique partnership using technology. So Chief Kelly, Deputy Chief Kelly can give more details, but that's one classic example of ways in which we're leveraging technology in Columbia in our great partnership with ShotSpotter.
Sure, we'd love to hear more from Deputy Chief Kelly about Columbia, and then we'll go back to Ralph. Okay,
so we actually found that probably over 81% of the time, people did not call the police after hearing gunshots. It was an eye opener for us even. So what we did was had our officers out and actually making contact with the public, hanging door knockers on the door to let them know that we're investigating this crime. And it's been a marked increase in the calls per service that we are getting to report. And in our community meetings, it's just overwhelming response to how citizens are more willing to come forward. Because, public safety is not just about policing. We want to empower as much as we can our citizens to help police their neighborhoods, help protect their neighborhoods. Because no matter what zip code you're in our city, everybody wants the basic same thing, safe, healthy, clean neighborhoods. And it's how we get there is the answer. And with ShotSpotter is helping us do that. But again, leveraging that technology. At the end of the year, we're rolling out all of the data that we can just to show how we're policing and what improvements need to be made.
Thank you. So we've heard about acoustics and gunshots and how that's so relevant to the community. So I'm going to go back to Ralph. But Ralph, before we get into your question, just for our audience, can you please describe this awesome product that you do, just for everyone who's not familiar, just before we get into your question? So could you just give us a little bit about what ShotSpotter is and how you work and the phenomenal technology behind it?
Sure. So it's really incredible technology, and it basically comprises three things. It comprises sensors, wireless networks, and software. And when we deploy in a city, we'll typically deploy about 20 or so sensors per square mile, and these sensors are spaced out from one another. And the idea is that these sensors ignore ambient noise, but recognize and then timestamp impulsive noises like pops, booms, and bangs. So imagine someone firing a gun. When they fire a gun, that sound, that pop sound will emanate out. And when it hits three or more sensors, it'll hit those three or more sensors at different times. We're able to take that time differential and do a mathematical calculation in the software to determine a place. That creates an incident. So, 6 or 7 sensors participate. We're basically triangulating the exact location of that pop, boom, or bang. We'll then go through a couple of classification steps to ensure that alert before published is in fact a gunshot and not something else. And this whole process takes place within 30 to 45 seconds of the trigger being pulled. And what makes the technology so compelling in terms of its use is a point that has been made a couple of times by the mayor and the chief, is that the vast majority of gun violence, believe it or not, goes unreported. It's become so normalized, sadly, in some of these communities where, 89% of the time, 81% of the time, we've seen certain situations where 97% of the time a gun is fired and there's no call made. And so this is a perfect thing to automate from a technology point of view. It basically takes a somewhat manual, analog, and very imperfect 911 call, and it perfects it into an automated, digital, very fast, very precise 911 call that can get a cop to a dot. And again, this all takes place within 30 to 45 seconds. And so it's a game changer. And I think the other thing I would just hit on that's really important, because the technology is really interesting, but it's more around the application of the technology that I think drives value. And Mayor Price knows this as well, because Newport News is a ShotSpotter user. And that is, it's very few individuals that drive most of the gun crime. Yeah. So you're not talking about over-policing a community. You're talking about trying to get in front of those handful of serial shooters that are driving 60 to 75% of gun crime in a community. And the community appreciates that, right? They want precision policing. They don't want overall over-policing. And as I like to say, communities don't need to be policed, they need to be served. Criminals need to be policed. And it's really important that you get to these shooting events and investigate them fully, because what the other thing we know is that there's a lot of gunshots before there's actually a homicide or a gunshot wound victim. So the reason it's important to respond to and investigate all shootings is, today's stop sign shooting is next week's homicide. So the quicker you can get to these scenes and do an investigation and determine who those shooters are, to have, interventions, both law enforcement intervention, and there's other interventions as well. I love ceasefire as a process and as a tool. It's not a technology, but it's a very effective tool to prevent and reduce gun violence, in combination with ShotSpotter, to really get people to self-regulate themselves and put down the guns. That's what you want, because the best intervention to have is a non-intervention, because they've self-intervened. That's what you're really looking for. So.
No, that's excellent. And so can we talk a little bit more, Ralph, about how you view technology, your technology, in concert with other technologies in transforming policing?
Yeah, so I'm a bit biased by admission. I grew up in a technology where I started my career in the early 80s working for IBM. And so I've always been fascinated by technology and seeing what it can do to transform businesses. And most of my life has been around using technology to transform commercial businesses. And later in my career, it was really fascinating to kind of come up on the company ShotSpotter that I joined in 2010 to see how a technology has an opportunity to transform how we're better serving and protecting our communities that I grew up in, like East Oakland in California. And there's such a great opportunity to take something that is broken or manual or doesn't happen very well or happen very fast, in the case of kind of gunshot notification, and completely automate it, and then combine that with best practices. Because at the end of the day, the technology detecting, locating, and alerting on gunfire doesn't mean very much if you don't have an intelligent response to those events. If you're not using the data the way Mayor Benjamin described, as a way to kind of create a system of record in terms of what's going on to improve transparency and community engagement. So, technology is cool, but how you apply it, how you use it to accomplish bigger objectives is the thing that keeps myself and my 100+ peers in the company super motivated. And we have the opportunity to see this technology applied in over 100 cities in the U.S. We also have some deployments internationally. And it's always very interesting to see how different agencies and cities move with the technology. And, we'll steal some things from Columbia, South Carolina, and apply that to South Bend, Indiana, as an example. We'll steal some things from Mayor Price and in his city and apply it in the city of Sacramento, and vice versa, because everybody has their own bent in terms of how to use the technology, but it really has to be around how they use it as a part of a broader strategy is so exciting. And we've got so much more work to do. There's probably another 200 plus cities that are out there that really do have the need for this technology, but we just have to have elected leadership and law enforcement be willing to kind of step up and do something about the problem, the way these two mayors have demonstrated they care enough to do something about it. So.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Ralph. And so we're going to go to a few more questions for the panel before we try to see if there's some questions for the audience. So if you have any questions, audience members, please put them in the chat box and our team will communicate it to me. So Mayor Benjamin, we heard Ralph talk a lot about the importance of technology and partnering with cities to move cities forward from an efficiency and innovative perspective. So Mayor, what would you say are some, and this is a little off script, but just asking, so I'm going to go to Mayor Benjamin and talk a little bit more about maybe even procurement or acquiring these technologies when you're thinking about partners that you want to partner with to implement these innovations in your city. What are some of the things you think about and you look for? And then I'm going to go to Deputy Chief Kelly to talk about maybe some of the implementation challenges or things that you've had to overcome in implementing these technologies, because I'm sure our audience wants to know, how do we get something like ShotSpotter? How do I get my counsel to implement this? How do we value these partnerships and how do we get it done? So we'd just love to talk about a little bit of your acquisition process and challenges and identifying some really great innovative partners for Columbia.
Sure. No, thank you, Stephanie. And obviously, it's always dangerous to go off script. You go too long, better than that. But, I remember, and there are things, obviously, we all, conversations we had that stick with us over time. I remember, 3-4 years ago, we were at our conference, AAMA conference, and I had a chance to do a fireside chat with John Rogers. And it stuck with me because I repeated literally scores of times since then that you want to do business with people who share the values of your city. And it's so important. We all have our bid processes, and depending on if it's RFP or RFQ or a typical procurement, the lowest bid or whatever it happens to be. But we have unique opportunities, I believe, now that it's actually become mainstream now because of the challenging times that we're living in right now, where you can actually construct procurement opportunities that go to the heart of the city that you want to be. I believe that the city is meant to be a platform for human potential. Cities are natural, living, breathing organisms. We're not perfect boxes drawn out by cartographers representing states. We're not gerrymandered congressional districts of political interest. We're living organisms that ought to provide an opportunity for each and every one of us to live up to our God-given potential. And as a result, as we spend the largesse of the public trust, public tax dollars, we ought to be able to be very strategic and thoughtful to make sure that every dollar we spend is indeed edifying for the spirit of the community going forward. So these are strategic investments that you can make in a way that allow you to do so many different things at once, at the very same time elevate the community. So we look to do business with people who indeed represent and replicate the values of our community. Our community is one that focuses on not just being innovative, but also being inclusive and equitable. And so now we endeavor to find partners that allow us to help live up to that true mantra. So that may have been a bit broader than what you're asking, but it requires us in every single one of our procurements. And we've had some procurements where I'll be honest with you, we spent a little bit more than we expected to spend, but we were paying for something very different than just crossing a T and dotting an I and filling an empty box. We were indeed trying to pay for building a healthier, more equitable community for the long term. And I would encourage folks that there are probably not as many opportunities right now to make good, smart investments in technology that also speak to the soul of your community. And probably very few moments, again, where you'll actually have the opportunity to do that. Like we're doing right now with ShotSpotter and some of our other investments. So I would hope that would color our decision-making processes going forward.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Mayor and Deputy Chief Kelly. So once you have this partner identified and you've acquired the product, you start the implementation. What do you see on your end as, either barriers or challenges or even some best practices when you have new technology being deployed at the police department level?
I would think that, getting the buy-in from your staff, actually showing them that the product does what it says it does is great. We did have some naysayers in the community that we had to win over, and I will tell you that we had to go back and get extra mileage out of ShotSpotter because some of our naysayers, hey, we want ShotSpotter too. But on a personal level, there is no more important task in my work than saving lives. And that's even saving the lives of folks who don't know that they need their lives saved. And ShotSpotter allows us to do that. We're getting on scenes faster now, and officers are applying tourniquets and first aid to folks that have been injured. Excuse me, I say folks a lot down south. And I think it at someone's most vulnerable or worst moment, we're there and we're able to provide assistance. Where in the past, we weren't able to do that as quickly. Some of the other barriers were there had to be some belt tightening as it related to our budget. So we are now more efficient and effective in how we're spending our dollars only on programs that we know work. And we want to make sure that we replicate that in other parts of the city. So I think being nimble as well as effective and efficient in how we spend those dollars and where we deploy our assets is a game changer. Quite frankly, we're approached all the time by different vendors and programs, and some products are just not worth it. We are very strategic in how we implement and get programs in the department that we know work. And we do a lot of studying at other agencies. We borrow other programs as well. And we're finding that the more research that we do internally, the more accountable we are to our public because, we want to replicate what works, not only here, but, in other jurisdictions as well.
Thank you. And I want to also go back to Ralph on the same question because I've heard from companies. We have a technology summit every year. We've talked to a range of companies from startups to large corporations. And sometimes the preference is not to innovate for government agencies or products that would be, implemented by governments because of approval processes or challenges. And would love to hear from you. I mean, clearly you have two great partners here with Newport News and Columbia, South Carolina. But Ralph, if you have the floor to tell mayors how to think about the technology, how to be, better public partners to these private companies and trying to deploy things that would really be game changers, what are some strategies or things that they should be thinking about when evaluating technology, or some challenges or best practices you've seen as a leader in trying to work with cities moving their cities forward?
Sure. Yeah. So I think I would first start by answering with the comment that budgets are moral documents. And I think how people spend their money does say a lot about the things that they value. And from our point of view, just given our experience and knowing about this normalization of gun violence and the fact that a significant portion of the time where guns are fired in at-risk underserved communities, there is no call to 911, which means there's no response. And think about what that means for a second. Think about living in a neighborhood, literally, where gun violence has become so normal, where kids literally go to bed to the sound of gunfire and might wake up to the sound of gunfire. And to not see any police response to that, what do you think that does with respect to that community's view of the legitimacy and trust that they have with that law enforcement agency? Because as sure as I'm saying that, and I just know this from my own experience growing up in Oakland, that there are portions of cities where if a gun is fired, there's going to be no question about the police response, right? And so that would make you a little bit cynical, I think. I mean, I know it would make me cynical, and I think it makes most people cynical. And so, and it kind of creates this, this process, this momentum of like, I can't trust the police. They're here to give me tickets for a busted tail light, but they're not showing up when someone fires a gun. I mean, and that's very difficult to drive public safety outcomes when you have that kind of dynamic going on. So our position is very clear. It's like, look, for a limited investment, you can completely change that narrative. You can change the narrative from 80 to 90% of the time not showing up when guns are fired to showing up to the precise location where guns are fired 100% of the time. And in the process of doing that, save a life or two. Maybe you actually have an on-scene law enforcement intervention that you can make in terms of arresting a perpetrator. You're oftentimes able to recover physical forensic evidence that you otherwise wouldn't be able to get in the form of shell casings and the like, which could aid your investigation in more quickly identifying that serial shooter that's, again, driving most of the gun violence problem. But the most important thing that you do is you're showing up and you're showing a community that their protection is important to you, right? That you're showing up in a respectful way, in a very precise way, the exact same way you'd show up in the more affluent neighborhood. That's what we have. If you go to our offices, you'll see that our statement, our purpose statement, is really around providing equal protection to all, right? And you can't have equal protection to all and not show up to the vast majority of gun violence. Now, I hear sometimes people push back a little bit and say, well, prove to me that ShotSpotter prevents and reduces gun violence by some, double-blind academic study or whatever. And there's definitely some work out there that's, kind of showing that evidence. But to me, it's really more fundamental than that. It's like, even before you talk about preventing and reducing gun violence, you have to tell me why it isn't important for you to show up, right? And that's what we enable a police department to do. I think for a very modest investment. It requires the technology, but more importantly, again, it requires the resource and strategy to be able to respond to these events, be able to use the data as a transparent way. And I love what the mayor said too about, or maybe it was Chief Kelly that talked about, after ShotSpotter and the community starts seeing you showing up to these events, you see the 911 calls go up. I mean, that's really incredible. And what that is, although honestly, it's not a useful call from a police response point of view, it is a very useful tool to tell you about public sentiment and how they're viewing the police department. When people pick up the phone to call 911 when they hear gunshots where they otherwise wouldn't be able to, or they otherwise wouldn't be in a position to do that or not do that or choose not to do that, they're doing that because they have a different view of police. And that's incredibly important. It's so important, and it's tough to measure that, but I can tell you, and you talk to any law enforcement profession, I put that question to you, Chief, is like, when a community trusts and has confidence in police, your case closure rates go up, your prevention strategies are more empowered. I mean, you're just able to leverage a resource, frankly, that the mayor doesn't have to pay salaries and PTO and benefits to communities. They're a free resource if you know how to activate them and use them to help them help them drive public safety outcomes. That probably didn't answer any of your questions, but I wanted to get that. I wanted to get that shot in there.
It's helpful. The value add is that there's a holistic opportunity to data gather, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. So no, that's really helpful. And speaking of gun violence, we've heard on the headlines there's been increases in some cities given the pandemic, given more people being home and job losses and other recipes for increased violence. And so what are we seeing right now on the streets from, and I'll send this over to Deputy Chief Kelly. What are you seeing in your Columbia, community? What are you hearing from your colleague police executives across the country in this moment right now, as far as trends relating to gun violence?
Well, we were twice the national average in gun violence here in Columbia, and so what we're seeing across the board is a more strategic response. We've recovered probably almost 1,000 shell casings this year, over 40 weapons. We're seeing a more effective response rate, and we're able to not only get on scene faster, but make better cases. ShotSpotter has allowed us to do that. But one step further is we invested in what was then called ShotSpotter Missions. It's now called ShotSpotter Connect. So now we're able to use more data to kind of drill down on where incidents are happening and try to predict, every Wednesday night at a certain time, certain things are going on. So we're able to do that. But as it relates to just in a more broader range, as it relates to crime, we are just imploring our public to be an extension of us and how they can help build one another up as community members and how we can be there to assist. We don't want to, tell a community what's best for them. We want them to be a part of the conversation. And technology allows us to do that because we're constantly showing data of, what's going on in the areas. And a lot of times they're not aware of it, but we want them to be a part of the solution.
So Mayor, what I've heard is, cost implementation, changes, maybe increased gun violence that might require more investment and strategies moving forward. But we also have this challenge of, pressure on city budgets. So Mayor Benjamin, how are you thinking as you're moving forward and thinking about budgeting and how you're going to have to prioritize the needs and the increased needs in your community, given the current climate?
Well, as you and Mayor Price well know, I like to keep my eyes on the bottom line at all times. We finished the last 10 years of the budget surplus. We've never raised taxes here. We have invested in policing and in parks and the arts and all the things that we can do by being very good stewards of taxpayer dollars. We right now this year is kind of with the pandemic and which has arrested literally every single revenue stream of the city. And look, we watched the American economy shrink by a third in the second quarter, about 5% drop in GDP the first quarter. Someone likened this as someone telling your house is on fire, and then when someone says, "Hey, by the way, there's also a sinkhole in front of your house," and then someone says, "Oh, too." You got this trifecta right now, which really requires you to be even greater stewards of those resources. We've had to cut a significant amount from our budget with that, but back to as Ralph said, the budget being a moral document. I mean, you invest in the things that are most important, and I do believe that one of the great silver linings of this conversation and that we're all having as a country right now is it's requiring us to reorder our priorities in a very meaningful way. We're going to continue to make strategic investments. I think, going to spend a whole lot more time talking about some very creative, thoughtful P3 or P4s, not just public-private partnerships, but those that bring in the essential role of philanthropy as well. There are a lot of foundations and others on the sidelines looking for creative ways to really be involved in helping create healthier communities, finding ways to bring them in as a partner. Again, these rural partnerships can be key at this moment. So we are, we haven't slowed down in our investing. We're doing more in terms of housing. We're doing more in terms of public safety. We're doing more and some creative efforts around everything from universal basic income to mobility. So we're just having to be a lot more creative. Now we're going to tighten our belts, but we're going to have to do more. And I do want to say this before I finish. You all are very impressed with Deputy Chief Kelly. He joined us at age 13. At age 14, he actually pledged to make us Psi Phi. So you gotta be impressed by that. So
we won't hold that against him.
So okay. So I think this is a question from the audience that I just received, and it follows on to the technology. And I think this probably would be just for the mayor. Do you expect other agencies to also want to implement technology to enhance efficiencies beyond policing? Mayor Benjamin.
Absolutely. I mean, it's an ongoing conversation. I mean, I think right now, everyone is trying to determine how you not only spend your dollars more effectively, but more efficiently, and how you do more with less, which means that sometimes actually you're achieving several different goals off of spending the very same dollar. And I think you're going to start seeing some of these walls break down. The fact that so many of us are conversing, via the internet and telecommuting. It's kind of shaking the foundations of some of the things that historically we've invested in that maybe we have not needed to invest in. So how do we leverage technology in ways that help us not just being an efficient municipal corporation, but again, help us meet our larger goals of creating a healthier, safer community. So yeah, I would expect that we'll see in every aspect from how we procure goods and services to transportation and mobility. Obviously, looking at ways in which we can be better stewards. So we have the largest water and sewer system in South Carolina. So how we provide the gift of life through water and obviously wastewater and we're spending a good bit of resources also. More tools to help us deal with as we look at more climate change and inclement weather events. So yeah, I would expect that every single organization is going to have to be looking now at how they are much more efficient and technologically advanced to get prepared for what we've seen in the acceleration, Stephanie, and some of the stuff that we've worked on the future of work and the way in which our communities are changing very dramatically. So yes, that's a D, all the above, probably in every single area in which we operate right now. More technology is necessary and partnerships are necessary.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mayor. And we are at the end of our panel. What a great conversation. That hour flew by. So I'm just going to go to each of our panelists for a very brief 30-second concluding remarks. We have three phenomenal African-American male leaders in this moment where our communities really need your leadership. So thank you so much for your time. So I'm just going to go to Deputy Chief Kelly, Ralph Clark, and then I'm going to close it off with Mayor Benjamin. So Deputy Chief Kelly, final thoughts.
Final thoughts, definitely let's continue as a profession in law enforcement to engage with our communities and have the rough, tough conversations and stay at the table to be engaged. But don't be afraid to leverage technology as a resource to make lives better of our community members. And that's why we're all here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Ralph?
Yeah, I'd say just looking forward to continuing the conversation. I think it does have the opportunity at this unique time to really transform how policing gets done and transform it from more of a warrior mentality to much more of a guardian, serve, and protect mentality.
Thank you. And Mayor Benjamin, take us home. Thank you.
Thanks to President Price, Stephanie, you and the whole AAMA team for always leading. I'd say three very quick quotes. One is that our decisions will determine our destiny. The future is subjective. Two cities equally yoked right now dealing with the same issues that approach them very differently will be two very different cities in 10 years. So the future is subjective. We can improve on the cities we want to indeed be. So we can't miss this opportunity to turn this pain and this passion into real progress. So let's not miss the window.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much to our panelists. For all of our viewers on the line, please stay put. We have a brief presentation as well as an amazing conversation this afternoon in the second hour on voting. So thank you again, panelists, and thank you to the AAMA team and President Price. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mayor Price. Thank you, Stephanie. Appreciate it. Yep, cheers.
Thanks.
Everyone be safe.
Bye. Thank you.
Hi. My name is Heather Foster, and I am the Senior Director of Public Engagement and Strategic Partnerships at Lyft. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak with you all today at the African American Mayors Association. 2020 has been quite a year. I don't think it's one that any of us could ever have imagined. We find ourselves in an unprecedented time as business and community leaders. I am encouraged by the resilience and dedication I see from each and every one of you as you continue to push forward in your communities. I joined Lyft last fall because I believe in the mission of improving lives through the world's best transportation. We have a unique opportunity at Lyft to break down an unfair disadvantage that often is not talked about. And what it is the unequal access to affordable and efficient transportation. If you've ever faced a lack of transportation, you know how debilitating it can be. Transportation is key to having most needs met in this country, whether it's feeding your family, getting to work, obtaining a job, and receiving adequate medical care. All people require the ability to get from point A to point B. And too often, we've seen the Black communities who are under-resourced disproportionately have low access. Transportation costs are the second largest expense for most American households. In U.S. metro areas, we've seen too often where Black community members typically have longer commutes, and Black households in America are more than 3 times as likely not to own a car. Inadequate transportation remains a massive barrier to upward mobility. So at Lyft, we thought to ourselves, what can we do? We launched the Lift Up Access Alliance this summer, which is a partnership of organizations including the Black Women's Roundtable, the United Negro College Fund, the NAACP, and 12 other organizations that will be partnering with us so that we can provide access and transportation in communities across the country. Together, we plan to provide 1.5 million discounted and donated Lyft rides over the next 5 years. I'm proud of the work that Lyft has done to provide these free and discounted rides through COVID-19, but we're also going to do more. When it comes to this election cycle, we know that the right to vote is supposed to be sacred, and the ability to cast your vote to any candidate that you choose is a part of the fabric of this country. The passing of civil rights legends C.T. Vivian and Congressman John Lewis, two men who I had the pleasure of knowing, are stark reminders of the battles fought and the sacrifices made to ensure that no one is denied the right to vote. While their efforts brought about monumental changes, there's still more that we can do. So at Lyft, we know that Black Americans are a part of those that drive with us and also are part of the community that we serve. So as a company, we share in this responsibility. And this year, we've already started to act. No matter how you choose to cast your vote, transportation should not be a barrier. We know that polling sites are consolidating. We know that people are volunteering to be poll workers and that there are still safety concerns given COVID-19. So what we're encouraging people to do early is to make your plan for voting. We are asking people to go ahead and make your plan. On Election Day, we are offering 50% off one ride, up to $10 to any polling location or drop box using a code. For the first time, this offer is also going to include our network of bikes and scooters in cities where they're available. To help more voters get to the polls, especially in communities where we know that access to reliable and affordable transportation is often limited, we're going to partner with a number of nonprofits. You may have heard of More Than a Vote. That is one we'll be working with to get people to arena polling locations. That will be in Atlanta, Charlotte, Detroit, Milwaukee, and Orlando. We're also going to work with our Lift Up Access Alliance partners, as I mentioned, and we're going to continue to build on other partners that we've come across. So we're very excited to see what happens with our Lift Up Voting Access partner this year. We look forward to the African American Mayors Association becoming a part of this network and working with you all together to continue to break down this barrier of transportation. Thank you for having me today, and I hope you enjoy the panel.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Stephanie Rawlings Blake, the former mayor of Baltimore, and I have the distinct privilege of serving as the moderator for today's second session, The Power of Our Vote. As we approach Election Day, the discussion will center around the importance of safe voting alternatives amid COVID-19, as well as address the concerns and the impact of voter suppression. We have a great panel joining us today, and I would like to welcome to the conversation former State Senator Tanya Cook, a policy lead for the National Black Caucus of State Legislators. Good to see you. Andrea Jones, regional lead in the South of When We All Vote. And Andrea, I did not check if you prefer Andrea or Andrea. I just want to clear that up now.
It's Andrea. You did wonderful. Thank you.
God bless you. I want to get to the end.
I understand.
All right, and perfect. And last, but certainly not least, Dameon Hewitt, Executive Vice President, Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under the Law. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks.
So civic engagement, and if you don't mind, I'm going to jump right up. And Mayor Price, thank you so much for the invitation. You're very kind, and I appreciate your leadership and the plans that you have for my organization. Who is very happy with the vice president pick, if you know what I mean.
Thank you.
Yeah. So civic engagement has long been thought of as a vehicle for transformative change. However, in the rise of COVID-19, the traditional modes of engaging and making contributions to our communities have been significantly altered. From your perspective, what are some of the innovative methods to communicate with your constituents or members that you found to be effective during this time? And what gaps are you seeing? And I'm going to open it up for whoever wants to start. Who wants to kick us off? Andrea?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Elected officials and civil servants have an abundance of means to reach their constituents and the general public at large. They can use social media, they can use their website, definitely their city websites that direct them to different departments. They can also do robocalls and text messages. All of these things they are already doing. A lot of cities, governments have been doing this for years, so it's nothing new. But because of COVID, it has been very, very hard for them to continue to do that at the rate that they're doing in terms of bandwidth and also in terms of people being able to connect using social media or using the web. So I encourage all of the elected officials to continue to do that, but then to find ways and mechanisms to be able to partner with those utility companies to make sure that people, especially in rural areas, have the ability to be able to get those resources.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Anyone else want to talk about alternative modes of reaching our constituents or our community?
I'll chime in.
Thank you.
Thank you. As you may be aware, I'm a former state senator, and I currently serve as an elected member of our Water and Gas Board here in the greater metropolitan area. And when I think about kind of what we used to do in terms of down-home retail politics before social media, in this environment, I think it's a great idea to get back to those. Some safe ideas that spring to mind are standing on the corner with a sign, or having drive-through events to rally voters, or if you're running for something, your volunteer base. So that's something that I've been suggesting here locally, and something that's come up when I'm in my role of policy lead for the National Black Caucus of State Legislators.
I think about the years I spent growing up in politics and serving over 20 years. You know, those corner waves are now probably the best things out there. Those early morning, who's done a few of those? Great.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Dameon, did you want to add anything?
Sure, thanks. You know, meeting voters and constituents where they are is so important. I think employing all means and a variety of means is very critical. We've placed a greater emphasis at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law on the digital and text. We now have text capacity for voters to reach our hotline, our vote hotline, 866-OUR-VOTE, the nation's oldest and longest standing nonpartisan election protection effort. And so via text, via online, 866vote.org, or just calling the hotline on the phone when you're on the way to and from running errands safely, or when you're at home in between Zoom calls. Just meeting everyone where they are is very important, and no one particular means works for everyone. And so having that variety is very critical.
I think you said something very important, that it's not one size fits all. So thanks for bringing that up. So over the past couple of months, elected officials and community leaders have been urging all households across the country to participate in the decennial census. Recently, we've seen several attempts to reduce the Census Bureau's efforts, to which the African American Mayors Association called for legislative action to avoid flaws to the census count. For Black and Brown communities that have historically been undercounted and further under-resourced, how do we ensure that we are counted, particularly during a time when our communities are impacted the most by COVID-19? Anybody?
I'll jump in.
Yes, thank you very much.
First, I would be remiss if I didn't offer greetings and thank you for the opportunity to AAMA on behalf of President Gilda Cobb-Hunter. She is in session in the office to which she's elected in the great state of South Carolina, and they are in a budget conversation. And there's not anybody on this call that doesn't know how important it is for us to be in the room when budgets are being discussed. So thank you.
Regards.
Absolutely, I will do that. And getting back to your question, NBCSL has been working through its committee structure to offer resources for its members on how to ensure that their constituents get their vote registered and heard. And so there are a number of resources, and I can't even recall all of them, but we have leveraged several under the auspices of the census and several voting organizations. There's a campaign to support the U.S. Postal Service, and we put all that information out to our members. And the good news about being a local politician is that you know how to leverage resources in the best way for your constituencies. So that is what we're offering, often as a resource on our website and sometimes through special webinars that we've sponsored.
I just have a follow-up for you. We've seen all across the country post offices basically under attack. Their machines have been disassembled. Their hours of work have been changed. What have you seen in South Carolina?
I am a resident of the great state of Nebraska.
Oh,
so I can't speak.
I can tell you what you know and what happens in Nebraska. I was just on the phone this morning with the Mr. Willie. Gosh, he has his
Willie Barney.
Yeah, I think so. He has
the African American Empowerment Network.
Yes, I think.
Or we have several Willies. Willie Hamilton.
55.
Willie. Yes.
Yes. All right. So
wonderful.
Anyway, well, please tell me what you're seeing in Nebraska with respect to interference with the post office.
Well, the good news here is that the word populist used to mean what it means now. The sensibilities in this state are around, well, don't mind us, we'll handle it here. And because west of the city of Lincoln we're one of the largest physical states with the smallest population states, our legislature voted before it adjourned in the spring to provide funding so that every county's election office could do remote voting. Now, given our statistics, the only, let's say, risk of the population of color benefiting disproportionately, or Democrats benefiting disproportionately from a mail-in ballot system, the risk is in Douglas County and Lancaster County. So that's an easier vote here than you might think in a red state with blue dots, if you will. So what our legislators are doing here, whether they realize it or not, is ensuring that everybody has the opportunity to vote. It also hasn't been unknown in our state to have weather events as early November. So this is something they're very, very, and it had not been politicized in the way that it has become recently.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Mayor, if I could,
Yeah, Dana?
you mentioned census. So at this hour, our lawyers are in a federal court hearing, a follow-up hearing, preliminary injunction hearing, which would essentially stop the Trump administration from continuing its effort to short circuit the census. As many of you know, and I think most of the viewers hopefully know, the administration announced that it was going to curtail census activities. The idea being, in the voting context, you want to make it as easier for people to vote, as easy to vote as possible, but we're seeing the opposite. When it comes to census, we want to make sure everyone is counted. That's what the law is, but this administration is trying to make it harder. And so,
just give us a little bit of background on the way the census was run in the past and the changes that the Trump administration has suggested and how that will impact our community, just to make sure that our viewers get a real sense of that.
Sure. Typically, in a non-COVID impacted and non-politicized census period, what you'd see is a response period during which people can submit their responses. This year it was by mail, by phone, or online. And then after that, you had what was called NRFU, the non-response follow-up period, where people will go door to door, census employees, tens of thousands, to knock on doors for people who had not yet responded. And it's critically important because we know we have many communities, including many in the Black community, we tend to be undercounted, right? Sometimes it's issues of trust, sometimes it's issues of access. And so it's critically important. And so essentially what the Trump administration has decided to do by fiat is to say, we're going to curtail all of that. Now, of course, many of those activities have been impacted by COVID, just as families and communities have been impacted as well. But we rely on the federal government to push through all of that. And they have the means. Certainly it has the auspices, even though it's underhired for many positions. The resources were essentially there to make it happen if there was political will to make it happen. But essentially, Wilbur Ross, Secretary of Commerce, said, we'll throw our hands up and we're just going to stop it all. This is the same agency that brought us that so-called citizenship question, which was a failed attempt, which we and other groups litigated all the way up to the Supreme Court. And so you see a pattern here. Let's make it as difficult as possible. So literally at this hour, our lawyers are in court. We have a temporary restraining order to stop the cessation of census activities, which has been extended for now some almost 18 days, which is a pretty long period of time. And today is really D-Day for the federal district court judge in California to decide in the court hearing happening in this hour, what will happen with the ruling going forward. So we're hopeful for a positive result. We have to make Black voices, Black votes, and Black vitality, Black life count and matter in this country through all means.
Absolutely. Thanks for giving us that background. And I am going to send up a prayer for your team of lawyers who are in California today, or I guess they could be anywhere virtually.
Well, they're all over. And shout out to the Urban League and Black Alliance for Just Immigration, who are named plaintiffs in that lawsuit. It's not just us alone, and many great lawyers, law firms. It's a strong coalition.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Andrea, did you want to add anything?
Well, I just wanted to add, in terms of communicating and being able to reach families. One of the things that I noticed is that school districts are extremely vital. One of the things that, in terms of my children being in school, and people can maybe attest to this, they are constantly sending us information either by text message, in the mail, or by email. And all of that information is vital, of course, to that community. But that's one way that we can kind of break through to make sure that we are reaching families, especially with the census. Coming from your children is very effective. So I just wanted to add that as a vehicle for people to use in order to reach their constituents.
Perfect. So civic engagement is deeply embedded in the history of minority groups whose voices have long been ignored or silenced. With the civil unrest that swept the nation after the passing of Mr. George Floyd, we've seen activists reach new heights as many have joined in on what the late Congressman John Lewis referred to as good trouble. For example, companies reevaluating their diversity efforts and speaking out in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. What do you suppose may be different about this time and the response that we've seen now compared to the countless times before? And the second question is, how do we continue the drumbeat and efforts of those who have been marching on the streets of our country right now? Who wants to get us started?
I think what's different right now is the diversity. We haven't seen a very big difference in terms of who is on the streets, who's protesting, but also in a lot of our companies. African Americans are now in these executive board meetings. They are having their own companies. They are extremely involved, and that's one of the reasons why past generations pushed affirmative action and those types of programs, because it puts African Americans in positions of power, but it also allows us to be able to interact with people. And as people get to know each other, as people interact with one another, then you start to see changes coming. So I think that the idea of diversity, even though some people might not see it as our strength, it is. It's our ability to be able to come together as a citizenry and make decisions together. One of the things that we can continue to do is not only should we should protest in the streets, but we should also mobilize, run for office, be in positions where we can make difference. Those who make the rules rule the world. And so if you are in a position where you can create policy, that is a very, very, very big deal. And that is something that will very much help our community continue to grow. But then also legislate. One of the things that we have to make sure that we do is that how we make changes is also not just in the streets, but it's in the legislation. It's being able to pass laws, it's being able to form coalitions. So all of those things coming together is very important in order for us to continue to make the change and continue to grow forth. And I encourage people to do that all the time, and voting is one of those as well. So thank you for letting me first.
Perfect. Tanya, did you want to add?
Yes. What I've seen differently, particularly in a place where people don't imagine there are many Black people or people of color, is Black Lives Matter marches in small towns where there really are not any people. There may be people of color who come in and work, but there is no Black community like there is in Omaha and Lincoln. Places like Hebron, I've not been there, Nebraska, are having Black Lives Matter events. And to echo what Andrea said, I was the silly goose that went downstairs because I had some pepper spray coming into my window, and I went downstairs to investigate that fateful night, that first Saturday night. And there were concussion grenades going off. When I went downstairs and took a look, just as Andrea said, young white people being involved, middle-aged and older white people getting tear gassed and pepper sprayed and pushed back by the police. So that is something that I see differently. I also see a new space for a conversation about moving beyond diversity programming and something over here that can get cut off the minute a budget changes, and more of a space for systemic change. Like what is it with this system that there's not risen a person of color or a woman to the senior executive level of this organization, and a government organization? There's something to look at there, and there's space for that now.
Got it. Sounds good. Dameon, did you want to?
Well, my colleagues just hit the nail on the head. Just to add to what they said, this is a time when especially younger people are rethinking everything, right? And sometimes that's a challenge to those of us who are a bit older, right? But it's a healthy energy that is not to be muted or even harnessed, but frankly to be leveraged. But what's different right now that I see is that when I think about the late Congressman Lewis and his good trouble, it wasn't just about being on the right side of history, although that's important, and he was, and it was important to him. It was also about, what do you put on the line responsibly? But what do you put on the line? And so to see these allies who are now turned into what we now call co-conspirators in a positive way, right? Who are actually putting something on the line, their reputational capital, their financial capital, their vote, what have you, in service of something that's really about, not just about the Black community, but frankly about what this country should be about. That's something that I see that's different. I hope we're at an inflection point and not just at another one of several moments in time.
Definitely. Thank you so much. I want to turn our attention now to voting and voter suppression. As November 4th is, we are focusing our efforts on ensuring that we all have the ability to safely cast our ballots. To lay the foundation, to lay the foundation, what are the voting options that are now available to voters? What are the key factors that voters should consider with regards to these voting options, and how may elected officials and community members disseminate information, this good information about safe voting to their constituents? Who wants to get it? Yeah. Andrea?
When we all vote, it's fighting for 3 voting principles: expanded access to the vote by mail, early in-person voting, and online voter registration. Voters can make their plan to vote that is best for them, and then they need to follow through. So it's one way to make a plan, but then also follow through with that plan. When We All Vote has a resource hub, which provides information for voters to check their registration status, request their mail-in ballots, locate their polling places, and prepare to vote by viewing their ballot and researching candidates, referendums, and ballot initiatives. You know, some people say, I don't vote because I don't know what's going on. I don't want to vote for that, or I don't know the candidates. Well, here's a resource for you to be able to do that. Elected officials should use every resource at their disposal as well. Communicate the voting options to their constituents. Less is not more. We have to make sure that we are speaking all the time to our constituents and people who are who need this information. Up-to-date information should be posted on website, messages sent to civic clubs and super neighborhoods, and robocalls, just like someone said back, you know, using those old traditional things that we used to get on the phone and call people. So one of those things that we have to make sure we do is to utilize both the new, which is social media, but then also combine the old, which is calling and also door knocking.
Yes, it's true.
Those good old telephone trees are coming back into fashion.
They sure are. Yes.
So I want to stay with you, Andrea, and talk a bit about, you were talking about the efforts of When We All Vote. How can mayors directly get involved with When We All Vote?
One of the things that we are doing in 9 cities in the United States is our Fuel the Vote initiative. Now, one of the things that we noticed in terms of working and doing online voter registration is that although online works and it does reach people, the face-to-face contact that you can have with someone is unmistakably the best way to engage and to get them to prepare and to register to vote. So one of the things that we're doing in cities is that we are combining resources. We are going to work with partners and with organizations to do a Fuel the Vote, a drive-through voter registration drive, food and voter registration drive. And what we'll do is that we will have partners and volunteers who will put grocery items in the trunks of people's cars. And then we will have our grassroots partners speak to the person about their voter status. That to me is one of the ways that we can do where we get people out, we can engage with them personally, but then we can also protect ourselves and protect everyone with social distancing. We need mayors and people's help to get the word out about that. But then we also want people to be able to understand that if there's any way you can do something similar in your community. It doesn't have to be a big thing. It could be somewhere in the grocery store. It could be at some of the recreational centers that are closed. You can have people out, you can ask them, you can provide them a service, and then you can ask them questions about their voter status. So that is the best way that I think that we can do in our communities, especially in rural areas as well.
You said something so very important, Andrea, and that is it doesn't have to be a big thing. We know that in Michigan, I think the vote count, the difference in the vote was less than 15,000 votes. And that's just in one state. So you can think about, I mean, and Michigan has a whole bunch of people. So it doesn't have to be a big thing. We just have to continue to do something. So yes. I'm gonna come to you, Dameon. The Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law is pushing for the Senate to allocate up to $3.6 billion for states to prepare for a more seamless general election. Can you speak to how these funds, if appropriated correctly, can be utilized to benefit our most vulnerable citizens?
Sure. And if I could, I just wanted to follow up on what Andrea was saying about these options, and I'll talk also about the specific question on the vote by mail. It's important that everyone request their ballots now. Don't wait. Today is National Voter Registration Day. And if you're not registered, today's, one of the last, good times you have, because in some jurisdictions, your time is running short to register well ahead of the election. I know our colleagues are partnering with When We All Vote right now on Instagram during the takeover with Tracy Ellis Ross. So I can't see them, but I'm glad to be with you all and your audience to really tout that effort. And Andrea, appreciate all that you all are doing, of course, with Michelle Obama. On early voting, know the rules, the lists, the hours. Right, go online or call our hotline 866-OUR-VOTE. And if you're going to vote in person, please do it safely and be ready for a long wait. We've seen crazy long lines in so many jurisdictions in the primaries. But to your question, Mayor Rawlings Blake, we're talking here about the nuts and bolts. That figure, $3.6 billion, it sounds like a lot of money, but it's frankly a drop in the bucket compared to what's really at stake. We know just for vote by mail systems alone, it will cost about $1.4 billion to meet the real costs of printing ballots, the postage, which has to be paid. It is not free. Drop boxes, which we're in hand-to-hand litigation combat right now in Ohio, and there was also litigation in Pennsylvania, which some people may have seen in a 60-minute story this weekend, regarding can you actually have drop boxes just to give people a safe option to drop off their ballot so they don't have to be surrounded by dozens or hundreds of other people in the COVID environment. Tracking ballots so that you know where you are in the process. Staffing, enhanced technology for signature verification so that you don't have ballots being thrown out because it looks, quote unquote, like signatures don't match. If you are signing a signature and one of your kids is tugging at you and you have dinner on the stove and you're worried about the stress of your job, your signature may be slightly impacted. It doesn't mean it needs to be thrown out or that it's somehow allegedly fraudulent. So that's just for the vote by mail systems. But other pieces that this money will pay for is safe polling places, frankly. Having the right protocols, because we know historically Black voters don't tend to vote by mail, not in huge numbers. Now that is probably changing this primary season and this general election out of safety concerns. But historically, that is not the way that many Black people vote. And so many of us may try to vote in person, and we need that to be safe. No matter what, it has to be safe. So this is really just a drop in the bucket. And here's the thing. Congressional action, we understand, is unlikely in terms of what may happen. Although the irony is that there's strong bipartisan support for a lot of these recommendations, a lot of these measures. In fact, people in multiple parties, not just the two primary parties, but multiple parties, have favored some of these steps in prior years. So all of a sudden, in this environment, when there's a power grab, everything becomes politicized. And that is really a shame for voters. But there are some things that local election officials can still do on their own, and state election officials in particular. And so we urge them to do whatever they can, and for the federal government to provide the resources to at least offset the expense, even for the jurisdictions that can afford to pay the upfront costs.
Definitely, and you are correct. 3.6 billion sounds like a lot, right. But based on what you said it would be allocated for, I feel like you could spend it. You've spent it 3 times at least.
You could spend that in Baltimore and the state of Maryland alone, as you know. So
thank you. All right. So one of the greatest challenges to a more just and equal America is the continued efforts at voter suppression across the country. Most recently, we saw pressure set on the University of Georgia to rescind its decision to close its voting site. What are the challenges that we're facing as it relates to voting and voter suppression? What do we know? What are the things that many of us don't know is going on? And how can we combat those efforts? Who wants to get us started?
I'll go ahead. I'll jump in.
Okay, Tanya.
And then others who maybe know some more formalized techniques can jump in. I think that the best way to get people engaged, it's a long-term strategy and it's not as tactical, but there's a local group here that is re-engaging new immigrants, for example, with the idea that reinforces the legitimacy of the process. So all these votes that sit home in communities of color, whether they are native born or people who are refugee immigrants or immigrants to this country, know that someone has knocked on their door, someone has registered them, and that they should register that they should cast their ballot on or before Election Day. I think another way that it is done, again, strategically, is by emphasizing what is going on down the ballot. Everybody has seen a ballot, and especially during a presidential election year, I was surprised a lot of people just stop at the top. But if you've got local candidates, whether they're for mayor, for city council, for county commission, for legislature, for ballot initiatives or bond issues at the bottom, promoting those things at the bottom help folks show up for the first front and back. Another sneaky thing that went through legislators a few years ago, courtesy of an organization I won't mention, was to frame cost savings as they related to elections. In the language of the bill, we're doing this for cost savings. The power to execute that sat with election directors who were on one side of the aisle, and they had the power to remove and move sites. So, for example, in a bellwether district for a Democratic candidate, this polling place that had been there for 40 years was not there on Election Day. So it is important to make a plan. Sneaky, but it happens.
It is those, when you talk about something that's been there for 40 years and now it's not there, if that is not a red flag that we are dealing with voter, really, Barry, you use the right word, sneaky voter suppression. What does anyone else want to? Oh, Andrea, I promised to come to you.
Well, when we all vote put together a Know Your Rights page, which to combat voter suppression. A lot of people don't know, what voter suppression is in terms of its action. We know the words, but how is it applied? And one way it's applied is when you go to the polling place and you might be at the wrong polling place. Well, they can do a provisional ballot for you. Some people don't know that. There are things that we, don't know. And when you don't know, you are subjected to people treating you wrong and telling you the wrong information. So we created a Know Your Rights page. But then we also wanted to work with an organization that is trying to recruit poll workers. I think one of the reasons why some people are getting away with some of the things that they're doing in terms of closing polling places is because they're saying we don't have enough poll workers. Usually poll workers, if you know, in the past, they're usually people who are retired. And so they have the time and they have the ability to be able to come in and to work on Election Day. But now with COVID, people are not as comfortable with doing that. So we've worked with Power to the Polls to try to recruit more poll workers, young people, college students, people who would like to give back and would like to learn how to be a poll worker. And you don't have to be an elderly person. You can be 18 years old to do that. So that's one way that we can do to help combat voter suppression.
Yeah, it boggles my mind when you think about all of the tricks that have been employed and the really shameful policies that have been put in place and have been attempted to be put in place across the country to suppress our vote, aligning with this time in our country where this pandemic is crippling us to staff the polls, because a lot of those retirees that you speak of are the ones that are the most at risk. So it's just like, what do they say? The devil is busy.
Yes.
Very busy.
Voting should not be
roaming.
It should not be political. Yeah.
It is the most patriotic thing one could do, but is somehow viewed as a problem. It's as if democracy is the disease that we should be fighting, and it's not. It's not.
Right. So I really have a follow-up to that question, because, I was listening to NPR and they were talking about what countries were going to send poll workers to observe our election. And I really wonder, when do you think it will be, or are we at risk of not really being the democracy that we profess in the midst of, the post office changes, the voter supreme, the poll closings, all of the different things I wonder when or if we have already lost our moral standing globally to be the champions and the fighters for democracy.
Mm-hmm.
It's not too late. It's not too late. I mean, I think what these developments, these tricks, the pandemic and the pandemic of racism have really exposed the awareness of it, is really the fragility of that democracy. The truth is, though, it's always been rather fragile. Yeah. It's never been something we could take for granted. And I've been a lawyer for over 20 years, litigating cases on battles that we thought we won in prior generations. So we have to remain vigilant. Elected officials have to, these things are not self-executing, right? You have to make sure that you have the strong capacity, continue to educate the public, continue to provide access, resources, supports. Democracy is not self-executing. And so we have to remain vigilant. And the fragility is inherent, but it's as strong as we make it. If we marshal our fiscal, human capital, our political will, and if we can do what I love to see from when we all vote, from the LeBron James effort, More Than a Vote, with whom we've partnered and others have partnered on securing poll workers and other pieces, when we start to mainstream the idea that democracy should be accessible to everyone, that helps to strengthen it. As much as the actual infrastructure does, I think that kind of that psychic infrastructure helps as well. When we start to really mainstream the idea of democracy should be accessible. It should not be a privilege for landowners or the 1% or the wealthy class or people whose voices, quote unquote, typically matter.
Right. And we do that through education. One of the things that we have to institutionalize it. And those people who started voting younger, when they started voting at 18, they wind up being lifelong voters. If you vote when you're 18 years old, you will continue to vote throughout your life. Then also, if your children see you vote, if you are an example and your children see you vote, then they become voters as well. So it is extremely important for people to understand that like you said, voting is something, and democracy is something that's continuous. It's something that you just don't stop doing. You have to continue to do it. You have to be involved locally. You have to be involved in your county. You have to be involved in your state and in your nation. So those are very important.
Yes. To your point about losing our spot as a beacon for international democracy, I think that's been happening for a while. But if you really recognize that this is an opportunity for us to take our citizenship seriously, our citizenship, we get a bunch of rights and privileges, but there's a responsibility. It's picking up trash in front of your house. It's paying taxes for children. I don't have any children in school, but I want those public schools to be strong for all of us. So I think that Black folks really don't need necessarily to be reminded that it's important because they fought to get included. However, the last 4 years should highlight that we need to inform ourselves and participate.
Definitely. I do not think it is a mistake that at a time where we need to be engaged the most as a community, there are so many efforts to disconnect us from civic engagement, to make us, to almost incite a hatred of our country, so we don't participate. And it's shameful on so many levels, but Mr. Putin and his bots are very, very, very active. Anybody else wanted to speak on that topic before I go to our next question? No? All right. With less than 50 days until the upcoming elections, I would like to hear from each one of you. What are our marching orders as mayors, elected officials, business and community leaders for getting out the vote? Tell me the top 3 things we can do.
Make a voting plan and stick to it. That's what we have to do. And when you go vote, if you go vote early, you go vote early and don't vote alone. So make your voting plan, vote early if you choose to vote at your polling place, and also take someone else with you.
Thank you.
That,
Oh.
I would say I love that voting plan piece, and I would suggest some components of it would be make sure you register or check your registration status. Make sure that you choose your option, as Andrea was saying, to vote, but then speak on it. Don't be silent about it. This is not the time. Speak on it. Tell your neighbors, your friends, your family. Don't take it for granted. Shout it from the hilltops on your social media and wherever about the fact of how you voted, what you're doing, and that others should do the same.
Perfect.
I'd echo what my co-panelists have shared. First of all, do it yourself. I'm going to vote early and I'm going to walk it to the voting box. And that way I am available to help others physically get to the voting space on the day of elections, or be available to candidates, or be available to help others on or before election day this year.
Perfect. So I want to give the viewing audience a chance. If you have a question, you can put that question in the chat box or email us at events@ourmayors.org. I'm going to give 1 second. Let's see. Just 1 second. All right, well, I think we're coming up on the end. Are there any, final thoughts? I don't know about you, but every single day I wake up with this gnawing feeling that there's something else that we can do, that there's something that we're missing to connect to voters so they understand that voting is not optional.
Right.
Am I the only one that
No.
is feeling like that?
No, you're not. I'm so anxious. I am so anxious. That's what you're saying. Yes.
Yes, I am thinking, first of all, as I said, the young people outside my window with the who were getting tear gassed and pepper sprayed reminded me that I am a different generation, which is good. So I need to just be open to any and all tools in the toolbox. I have the very ladylike way to get myself elected and speak and move in different rooms. There's always space for the other models of advocacy. I'll add one thing. Our organization is focusing on an initiative called ethical policing, which would highlight transparency and accountability, a little bit beyond the tactical things that are also happening in statutes nationally and statewide and locally. I think what I'm going to try to do is link my vote with the enactment of these laws, these ordinances. So, because sometimes I think, especially those around this table, this virtual table, take some things for granted about the link between you're just showing up to vote, not even if your person wins, but the fact that you show up. That's why we're seeing all this voter suppression, because somebody has run the numbers and they're not turning their way very shortly. So that it is an active discouragement. But I just remind folks, it's not just, oh, my person didn't win, or it's you showing up sends a message about let's change this conversation.
That's very interesting that you said that. That is so true. Because one of the things I notice in talking to people is that they say, well, either they don't like the candidate, or what they're saying is that I'm not going to win. It doesn't matter. Well, you're not voting just to win. It's not about winning. It's not about your candidate winning. It's about you being able to give your opinion and say what it is that you want. And one other thing that it does is that if your candidate gets 48% of the vote, then what does that say about maybe next time? That gives you a vehicle like, 3 more points and I would have lost. So I need to pay attention to the people who voted for, the person who's my opponent. So it's extremely important for people to understand why it is that we vote. You know, we don't always vote to win. You vote because you are supposed to be a responsible citizen, but you also vote because you want your opinion to be counted. And if you don't vote, to me, you're basically saying that you don't have hope. You don't have hope in the future. You don't have hope in your ability to make a difference and change. So that is a very frustrating thing. And I hope that we get to the point where we can kind of move past that mindset and that thinking, because you are so right. We would not be in the position that we are in now if we were not a strong voting bloc, and if we could not make a major change if we came out in mass. So thankful. I agree.
If Shirley Chisholm had not run,
Yes.
if Fannie Lou Hamer had not done what she did at Democratic Convention, if people had not died, if John Lewis hadn't marched across that bridge again and again and again, we wouldn't be, where we are today. And I think I certainly have friends. I'm still of a generation where within the last, few election cycles, I've had people say it doesn't matter, or I'm gonna, I'm not, my vote's a throwaway. It doesn't matter. I don't like these folks. And many of those are my same friends who have been in the streets, putting their lives and liberty on the line, at least in years past. And so my thought is your activism is not complete. I understand that voting is not a panacea for everything, but your activism is not complete. You cannot complete that circle unless you actually register and vote and speak on it too.
Well, Dameon, I have one last question for you.
Okay.
Well, it might be for more than you. I know that you could address it. There's a question from the audience. Who do we contact? What do we do if we experience voter suppression at the polls?
Call our hotline nationwide, 866-OUR-VOTE. Just call the hotline. You can go online. You can text the same number as well, if need be. And we're able to answer questions from voters all across the country, not just any particular jurisdiction. We're running this hotline around the clock. If we have a flood of calls and it goes to voicemail, we'll get right back to you. 866-OUR-VOTE. That's 866-687-8683.
Well, maybe the AAMA team can tweet that out and connect all of us so we can repost it. Anyone else or information about what to happen if we experience voter suppression efforts at the polls? Anybody else?
I know that locally there will be observers, and as we've found out, there may be some international observers there at the polls. Yes, I agree. Having observed internationally myself and not seeing much of a difference right now.
Well, I have to say, you wanted to say something, Andrea, before we close?
I was going to say, if someone does experience that, please call the number that Dameon mentioned, but don't leave. Don't walk away. You stay and you ask for a provisional ballot. If they do not give you that, you contact your council member. You just go and do everything you can, but do not leave. Do not leave until you vote.
I want to thank each and every one of you for your insights. I don't know about anyone else who's been watching, but I have certainly learned something in our engagement today. I want to thank Dameon. I want to thank Andrea. I want to thank Tanya. I want to thank all of our viewers, and I want to thank our sponsors at the ShotSpotter and Lyft for your ongoing support of AAMA. And with that, I would like to turn it over to the president of this illustrious organization for his closing remarks. Thank you very much for indulging this important conversation.
Thank you, Stephanie. And as president of the AAMA, I'd like to once again thank all of our guests, our speakers, and our viewers who turned in by live stream. We will continue to host discussions such as this on these important topics. And for more information on AAMA, that's the African American Mayors Association, or our upcoming activations, you can go to www.ourmayors.org, or you can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Our Mayors. And we look forward to connecting with you again, and we wish everybody to have a safe and a wonderful afternoon. Thank you again for your participation.
Thank you. Thank you.